So, Merb. This is a little web framework I've been working on with a weird name. Code. This thing started as a little hack to be able to do file uploads outside of Rails and do little ERB templates in Mongrel. And just give me one of these little mics.
Test.
Okay, try this again. So, can you guys hear me in the back now with this thing? Okay, good. So, this thing started as this little hack because I had a friend was building a site that needed to do like 500,000 uploads and downloads a day, and Rails wasn't cutting it without 20 or 30 mongrels running. So, made a little dispatcher you could use that was thread safe, so you could do multiple file uploads at once with one daemon. And then it just kind of got fun, so I kept working on it from there. No CGIRB. I'm sure everybody's familiar with how crappy that is in the standard library. So I rewrote most of the request parsing and query parsing and all that kind of fun stuff to be thread safe and not tied to CGRB, which has numerous problems. This thing is kind of a clean room implementation of Action Pack. It's the view and controller out of the MVC, and it's ORM agnostic. So out of the box, you can use it with Active Record, but you can also use it with SQL or Data Mapper or roll your own back end. You've got configurable mutex locks, so when you do use Active Record, you have to lock around that, but it locks for a very small period of time. And if you don't use Active Record, if you use SQL, you don't have to lock at all, so since it's a thread-safe ORM. I've got pretty close to Rails-compatible RESTful routing. You can use Active Resource as a client for a Merb server. And the main thing I'm trying to do is use very little magic, keep the stack traces really small, and have really simple core code that's lean. Did I mention no CGIRB yet? Okay, so I'm getting ahead of myself. Small core framework, ORM agnostic, simple code over magic code, keep the stack traces short, no alias method chain allowed in core. Thread safe reentrant code whenever possible, and yeah, that's kind of the idea. Because in the end, no code is faster than no code. And in my book, simplicity and clarity is much better than magic when it's time, when you're writing a core framework. I feel like simple code is much better than magic and monuments of personal cleverness that we've seen in some code. This core framework is going to stay very small and simple and easy to extend with plugins, and the features of the framework are almost frozen at this point. Working towards a 0.4 release, which is going to be the release where I start pushing this for people to use in production. And after that, any additional functionality is going to be a plugin. And we've got a pretty cool system for plugins where you can have a normal plugin, like in a plugins directory with an init.rb and everything, or you can use the Merb plugin manager to install plugins as gems, and it keeps a manifest of the gems you've installed via the interface, and then when you deploy, you'll be able to do a plugin gem migrate where it will sync up the gems that are installed on that computer and make sure the right versions are installed for that application. So here's one of the big differences in the dispatching that's gotten me some really good speed increases. Usually people are using Merb with Active Record right now, and you can use Active Record in thread-safe mode, but it uses a connection per thread to the database, so you'll usually exhaust your database connections really quickly. And I've seen a few times data get mixed up between threads when it's really heavily loaded. So when you use Active Record with Merb, I still lock, but the lock is smaller. Like in Rails, when a request comes in, Mongrel locks the mutex, if you're using Mongrel, and the CGI parsing, the route recognition, filter chain, call your action, render template, everything happens within the lock. In Merb, the request comes in, CGI parsing and route recognition is done in a thread-safe manner, so multiple of those can be done at once. Then the mutex only locks around anywhere where you can call active record, your filter chain, your action call. So, anytime you do threaded programming with locks, you really want to keep the locks as small as possible, because the bigger the lock, the more contention there's going to be for it. Here's a little Hello World example from a Merb app, and it's pretty fast. Like, the whole idea of this thing is to have the framework be small and light as fast as possible, so that the time spent in your application is spent in your own code instead of framework code. So you can see there's very little overhead here, serving a little Hello World example in 1.5 milliseconds per request. So the router is one of the cooler pieces of Merb. It's a re-implementation of Rails router done in a different style. So it's only 300 lines of code, including all of the RESTful routing stuff built on top of the core router compiler, whereas Rails has quite a bit of code and an additional amount of code for the resource stuff. The basic idea behind Merb's routes is that, like here if I'm saying our resources posts, and I'm going to put out the compiled regexes for the routes and the compiled statement, this is what it looks like. These up top are the regexes that are stored in this compiled regex array, and then it basically creates a big case statement with regexes, and it returns a hash of different things. So basically, what happens is when you start up Merb, it builds these routes in this lambda, and then it installs it as a method on the router. So when request comes in, it gets past the path. It runs through all these regexes and finds the correct one and passes out a hash of different options back to to decide which controller and action and all that kind of fun stuff to work with. There's some key differences in how you work in a Merb application. There's no auto render, so the return value of your action, the method of your action, is what gets returned to the client. This opens a lot of flexibility up. Merb's render method just returns a string, so you can render multiple times without getting a double render error. Also, the fact that you can, whatever you return from your action is what gets delivered to the client, opens up some cool stuff. So you return a string of HTML from the render method, that'll get returned to the client. If you return an I/O object, like file open or I/O new, return that object, it will get streamed out to the client outside of the mutex lock. And if you return a proc object, the proc object will be deferred and called later outside of the mutex lock. So you can kind of use like futures or whatever to capture some kind of code you want to do in a proc, drop out of the mutex, and unlock so that other requests can start happening, and then that thing gets called later by Mongrel in a thread-safe way. I've also got, since the rendering is not tied to the response, it's not writing directly to response, it's just returning strings, Merb has part controllers, which are basically exactly the same as normal controllers, except for they don't have any of the overhead of a web request. They piggyback off the web controller that caught this request. So kind of like Rails components, but very cheap, just like you get filters and rendering and everything you would get in your normal controller in these part controllers, and then you can render multiple parts in a page. So it allows you to encapsulate small little applets or whatever in your page without paying a big expensive cost of resetting up a whole request and response and all that kind of fun stuff. The before and after filters in here use throw catch instead of returning false to halt the filter chain. This allows for some really cool flexibility. When you want to alter the way the filter chain is going, you're not held to the option of only returning false to halt the filter chain. You throw halt symbol, and then if you don't give it an argument at all, if you just throw halt in a before filter, it will call a method called filter chain halted and return a default response. If you pass it a second argument, throw halt, not your mommy, that string. So it will halt the filter chain and return that string to the client. In the smaller one, you can see that since render returns a string, you can throw halt and you can render a template instead. Or you can, if you say throw halt, comma, colon, and another method name, it will call that method for you and return the response from that. So it kind of opens up some really neat ways to flow around your application with these before filters. We just got this cool setup in here for controller exceptions. These are the basic, all your different HTTP status codes. I don't know if you guys can see this very well, but we've got accepted, okay, 200, not authenticated, 404, all the different HTTP status codes are exception classes, and we actually we actually have these exception classes customized so that when you raise one in your controller, like here at the top, raise not found if product nil, that will actually raise the not found error from here, which has a 404 status. And if you, in your app folder, you have app models, we use controllers, you also have app exceptions. And you can name, say you wanted to throw bad request, you put app exceptions bad_request.herb, and that will actually render that template for that error response. And you can make your own custom error responses as well. We'll subclass unauthorized as admin access required, and you define this error response method, and you actually get access to the request and the params and the session and everything you would have in a normal controller, and the render method. So you can render your own custom templates for these exceptions. So it's a pretty cool way of raising the proper HTTP errors and being able to customize that really easily. By default, if you don't have any templates for any of these errors, they raise whatever the name of the exception is and a little message in the status, and they return the proper status to the client. So it's kind of a cool way to control flow. So why should you care about any of this? I know everybody loves Rails, and I do too. I've been using it for a long time now, and I've just seen a few things happen, especially hosting so many applications. It gets 10 to 20% slower on each consecutive release, more RAM for each process as life goes on. And everybody says premature optimization is the root of all evil. But when is it not premature anymore? When is it not premature anymore? So there is a point when optimization matters. And I just kind of feel like Rails has gotten very big, and there's a lot more code in there than there needs to be to do what it wants to do. So what's the current status of Merb? There's quite a few production applications out there right now running on it. Lots of them are back-ends for Rails applications, serving as like a REST service that can handle multiple clients at once. There's a site called Dropbox.com that does file uploads and downloads a lot. They're doing like 600,000 uploads a day. And Merv has some cool built-in features for streaming, where the upload can come in and be streamed from, as it's coming in and being parsed, it can be streamed up to S3, because this application stores everything on S3, and Merb just acts as a proxy. So it can stream up to S3, and on the way back down, it also streams through Merb for being able to use authentication and stuff. And as it starts to, it opens a link to the file on S3 and starts streaming it in chunks. At the same time, it's blowing these chunks down the pipe down to the client through Merb. So it's pretty cool, blowing chunks. So right now the release that's out is 0.3.7, and I just released that a couple days ago, and then I started heavily working on Trunk, moving towards the 0.4 release, which is going to be the first release where I really recommend people to start using it. And 0.4 is going to be feature complete as far as the core framework, and everything else is going to be pushed into plugins. I really don't want the core to get bloated at all. It's going to stay small and stay hackable. So I think that's the best way to go with this. How can you guys get involved if anybody wants to? I've got an open door SVN policy. You send me 1 or 2 good patches and you get commit access to the repo. I just ask that you don't code fist me. Just run it by me if you got a big change first. But I like this way of working. That's how they're working on Rubinius as well. And it seems to work really well. People are excited to be able to have commit, and they seem to be, it's working out really well. They're really respectful, and I've gotten quite a lot of good patches lately. The IRC channel is pretty active. You can come in there and talk to us. I'm usually in there all the time. If you have problems, there's a mailing list. What still needs work? I can always use more docs and specs. It's probably the easiest way to dive in and help is to find a part of the framework that you don't understand and understand it, and then document it and spec it or whatever. I'm also still working on a nice harness for the applications. I've already got the core libraries, testing libraries for fake requests, fake responses, fake controller, so you can make controller requests without having to start up a server or whatever. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to keep all the helpers agnostic and allow people to use test spec, RSpec, test unit, whatever they want. They'll still have access to all the testing helpers, but I'm not going to force whichever one down your throat. So even the testing harnesses are going to be a plug-in. I'm also pulling out the form helpers. They're going to be a plug-in. Everything's going to be a plug-in. It's going to stay really small. We've got a little bit of, so if anybody wants to help out with any of this stuff, that'd be great. I'm still working on refactoring the framework, app plugin, initialization stuff. It's a little bit rough in there. It's kind of grown out of control a bit. So 0.4 is going to actually change quite a few things as far as the app layout, a couple other things, but it's going to make for a much more robust system. Writing tutorials as you learn is a good way to help. What's in the not so distant future? Rubinius compatibility. I'm working with Evan closely to get Merb up and running on Rubinius. The last hurdle right now is mainly that Mongrel doesn't work with Rubinius yet, but Rubinius is something I'm really excited about. I think it's going to be really big. What else is in the future? More profiling optimizations. I'm really cautious about adding any code to the core path that requests come in through the framework, because right now it's pretty optimized. It usually only takes like a millisecond to route the request, instantiate the controller and all that kind of stuff, and then so I'm really keeping that path optimized, and I'm always running profiling and benchmarks on each revision and stuff. So more tools and creature comforts. There's not a lot of generators or other stuff like that, but there's some. And core is just going to stay lean. I'm going to be feature complete here very shortly and stay that way. And so I get asked this a lot: why not work on Rails instead of making a new framework? And there's a number of reasons why. I have done a lot of work trying to optimize Rails, applying the same dispatching stuff I learned in Merb, but it's just there's so much backwards compatibility baggage with Rails right now that it's hard to make radical changes for performance increases without like breaking lots of plugins and applications and pissing people off, So it was actually much easier to explore all this stuff in my own framework than to try to apply it to Rails. I'd love to see some of this stuff go back into Rails, though, and I really hope that Rails 2.0 can slim itself down and move some stuff out into plugins, kind of follow some of the same stuff I've done here, because it's, Rails is a great framework. I just think it's gotten a little big for its britches. Yeah. Yeah, that's what I keep hearing, and I really want to see that happen. I would be more than happy to roll all the stuff I've done in Merb into Rails 2.0 if their core team is really ready to really make some big changes. But there has to be sweeping, like Action Pack needs to be completely RF starred and done from scratch, in my opinion. I mean, but I'd be more than happy to work. This has just been my pet baby where I hack on to relax in the evenings. So it's been a lot of fun. But Rails has all this adoption and everything. I'd love to see anything I've done in here go back into Rails 2.0. So we'll see what goes on with that. I'd really like to see. I'm not sure what they're thinking. Are they going to do another release before 2.0 of like the current stuff? Yeah, I think Edge should go out as like 1.5 and then start getting radical for 2.0. I think that's really the way forward to go. Rails also, I love it, but it does punish you if you go off the golden path. There's a lot of things that are kind of harder to do if you're not right on the golden path. A big part of that, I really like the way in Merb that we just return whatever is the return value of the controller action to the client. It opens up a lot of flexibility, I think, for making services. Mostly what I've used built Merb apps for myself is services, little web services, different XML and JSON RPC services and stuff. And writing those, you don't even have to use render at all. You're just returning JSON strings or XML or something. And it makes it really flexible and fast to be able to just return whatever your return value of your action is. And I feel it's a little more Ruby-ish as well, return values. So Merb is kind of a hacker's framework. It's not going to have the kitchen sink. It's going to be small and light, and it's going to allow you to easily build it up towards your problem domain instead of having everything and trying to fight it to do stuff that it's not meant to do. So kitchen sink not included. I think I probably went pretty quick here, but I figured there'd be a bunch of questions, so. There's some stuff you have to change. The calls to render are different and they're required, so there's no auto render. The before filter syntax is different, but pretty easy to port stuff over. Almost any active record plugin will just work fine with Merb, but action controller stuff won't usually. So it depends on the app, There's someone made a Merb plugin too that's like a port of the Rails form helpers, so you could use that in your views. Merb supports 4 templating engines out of the box: Haml, Markaby, XML Builder, and eRubus. And it's pretty easy to add more template handlers. So yeah, there's a couple people I know that are porting some big apps over, but they're not finished yet. So we'll see what they're going to do, some write-ups after they're done. I've been pretty much doing greenfield development with it. I haven't really ported any Rails apps myself yet, but it's probably not. It's definitely going to be some work, but it's probably not that bad because I love Rails, and you can tell in Merb it's a lot of stuff I've taken from Rails that Rails just does right. So there's just a few things that I kind of felt differently about. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. It's possible. Right now. Oh, repeat the question. He's asking if it's possible to make Merb dependency list be less than it is, and yeah, it is. And the 0.4 branch that I'm working on right now actually uses kernel autoload for all the templating engines and all the extra stuff. So it will not actually get loaded unless you refer to one of those constants. So yeah, we can talk some more a little bit after this. Right now, Merb is tightly integrated with Mongrel. That's how it gets some nice speed and boosts. But I do have a a rack. Have you heard of rack? Yeah, so I have a rack interface or a rack handler that I'll be getting out there soon. But it doesn't perform as well as Merb on straight Mongrel because Merb does a lot of the same stuff rack does as far as request processing and CGI stuff, and it does it faster than what rack does. But sometimes that doesn't really matter. And I'm going to have the option to use rack, which will be able to allow you to run Merb apps on CGI or fast CGI or WebRick or Mongrel. So yeah, that's coming pretty soon. He's asking what's a typical speed up I've seen. It really depends because once you get a big app going, most of the time is actually spent in your code. But if you compare, if you just compare the dispatching and stuff, it's quite a significant speed up factor of, if you make a fresh Rails app and you do a render text hello world in an action with sessions turned off, you can get about 200 or 300 requests a second. And Merb, you can get about 600 or 700. And if you use the event-driven Mongrel, you can get about 1,200. So there are some significant improvements there. Mm-hmm. See, that's the thing, though. The Merb stack traces are very small. They're usually about 10 or 12 frames deep. So, yeah, someone else made the patch for these exceptions, and I was a little worried about that myself, as far as because exceptions carry with them unwinding the stack and all this kind of stuff. But I benchmarked it, and it doesn't affect the framework at all if you don't use those. And when you do use them, it's not that much more overhead as far as when you're throwing an error anyway. Right, exactly. And the alias method chain is a big responsibility for a lot of that, I think. But yeah, anybody else?
What is an example when you would want to render something like you were talking about how you don't run into the double render error?
Right. Well, say you had a few different templates you wanted to assemble into a page. You could do like an instance variable equals render this, instance variable equals render that, and then render another template with those instance variables inside of it. You see what I mean? There's not a whole lot of times when you want to do that, especially if you use a part controller instead, because then you can render multiple parts, and parts can have their own views and layouts, and then get nested in the main controller views and layouts. But the main thing I like is not having render tied directly to the response, because it just allows for a little more flexibility.
Why you copied that
I'm probably unconscious. I mean, the only thing I don't like about he's asking in the Merb router setup, when you say Merb router prepare, do all this kind of stuff, I pass the router to the block and then say R add, so add the routes or whatever. And he's asking why I don't just use instance eval, so I can just say Merb router prepare, add. And the only reason is that instance eval has bitten me a lot of times in the past in writing DSLs, because the scope of self being different, you can't use instance variables from the surrounding scope and all that kind of stuff. But that probably doesn't apply to this because you won't be using instance variables in there, so maybe I'll consider changing that. But I think it's just my own experience with instance eval and causing confusion. Like there's this plugin I wrote called EasyWare that's a query builder on top of Active Record, and it uses instance eval. And there's just been tons of support people asking for help over, saying, why doesn't my instance variable or my method show up inside the block, So I kind of got turned off to instance eval in DSLs because of that. That's the only reason, I think.
You got experience with a Merb app and Rails app sharing the same model, basically pushing the file uploads to the back, things that need to be, let's say, into a Merb app, but keeping security Rails.
Yeah, so he's asking how can you work with Merb in conjunction with Rails and have Merb be the file upload server and whatnot. And Merb has a Rails session parasite mode where you have it connect to the same database and it can so you can say, you're in Rails, you're going to do a file upload, so you redirect to a Merb app on a subdomain or a URL rewrite or whatever, and Merb will read the cookie and pick up the session just like it's coming out of Rails. Although, it's not the same environment it's being unmarshaled into, so the old adage applies. Don't store anything but strings and integers and arrays and hashes in your session. Otherwise, you're going to be asking for trouble. So as far as using the same models, yeah, you can. It can get ugly sometimes, if you try to use all the same models. Usually the apps I've made to integrate Rails and Merb only share like the upload model and, the session. And do it that way. So you redirect to the Merb app, do the upload, then have it redirect to the Rails app with a query string or something that tells it what to do, and then all the stuff's already in the database, and the Rails can just go from there. No, you have to tell it not to use it. He's asking if. Sorry, I keep forgetting. He's asking how do layouts work, and it's built in. Like when you just say render, it will render with the layout, and it will use the same thing. Where if it will try to use application.html unless there's if you have a post controller and there's a post.html layout, it will use that. Or you can specify a layout, or you can tell it no layout. So it's pretty similar in that respect. Yeah. Anybody else?
Eval, really one night.
Right. Yeah. And I think they have that in Rails as well right now in actual support somewhere, right? And it's exact kind of a hack. But yeah, 1.9 is going to have some interesting features. It's going to be quite a bit of porting to get lots of apps to run on there, though. I feel like there's a bunch of differences. Like in 1.9, send will not call private methods, and there's that, Rails plugins and all that stuff. They use that pervasively, active record base, send, include this, blah, and that's not going to work anymore. But yeah, okay. Right, but yeah. Yeah. I've been using SQL, SEQUEL. It's pretty sweet. It's more like the objects it returns are just hashes, and it does lazy loads. Like if you grab a bunch of rows and iterate over them, it'll grab them one at a time from the result sets, and it's pretty efficient, and it's got a connection pool, and it's thread safe and all that kind of fun stuff. It's a little bit lower level than Active Record as far as how you use it, but it's fast. And then there's a project called Data Mapper that's not ready for production use yet, but it's really interesting. It's a data mapper pattern instead of an active record pattern, but by default it emulates active record, so you can kind of port your active record models over by just having them inherit from data mapper instead of from active record, and make a few other changes. That's one to watch for sure. And I still have an ORM project I'm working on, but it hasn't seen the light of day yet. That will be probably sometime later this year coming out. So that's right. Yeah, no, I think it's right on Ruby Forge. You can go find it there. Yeah. Can return anything pretty much, and there's a little part helper where you can say, Am I on now? Yeah. So he was asking, in a Merb part controller, can it return other stuff besides a string or whatever? And the answer is yes, and it's up to you what you want to do with it. The part controllers, there's a helper in there called part, I think. I can't remember exactly, but basically if you had like a... Here, let me... do this right now. I can show you later, but okay, cool. Okay, let's tell this that it's Ruby. So you could say part to-do list index, yeah. So you could say what this will do is this will call the to-do list part, call its index action, and return the string or whatever it returns. And in your part controllers, you have full renders with layouts and all that kind of stuff. So basically, the part controllers act, and you code them just like normal controllers, but they don't have their own web stuff associated with them. When you call params or sessions or whatever that stuff, it just delegates to the web controller that calls the part controller. So you can, in a view, you can call this in a view or in a controller or whatever. So in your view, you could have multiple parts, part sidebar, this action, this state, or whatever. And they're really lightweight overhead. They're just plain Ruby objects, because the way Merb works is there's an abstract controller, and it doesn't know anything about the web, but it knows how to dispatch and render and do before and after filters. And then the web controller inherits from that and knows how to parse the CGI and all that kind of fun stuff. Part controllers inherit from that and know how to do their own deal. There's also mailer controllers. So for the mailers, you have full controllers with layouts and views and their own whole separate stuff as well for building emails and all that kind of stuff. So, anybody else? All right. Thanks a lot.